Anzac Day across the ABC.
Welcome to Afternoon Briefing this Friday. Greg Jennett with you from Parliament House in Canberra on Ngunnawal country, and once again Fran Kelly's in Sydney on Gadigal land. Fran, welcome back. Congratulations on powering through to the end of another week in fine fettle by the looks of it.
Week 2, Greg, week 2.
Yeah, week 2. It has drawn to a close, that much we can say, Fran, but probably not in the way that the ALP necessarily would have wanted. The Labor leader, of course, is holed up at home in Sydney on the first full day of 7, count them, 7 days to be spent in COVID isolation, Fran.
That's right, I've been able to talk to Anthony Albanese and we'll bring you that interview in a moment. But before we do, Greg, here's how day 12 looked for Scott Morrison in Brisbane and also for Labor adjusting to the idea of a campaign without a leader.
Labor was scrambling last night to implement a backup plan given Anthony Albanese has tested positive to COVID.
But I sent him a message wishing him well. I hope his symptoms aren't too bad and that his experience will be like most of those. About 50,000 Australians a day are contracting COVID and they're getting on with things.
Draw it down, get a little bit of that's it, back in. Put back up.
Oh, there we go. See, it's not easy.
It's not.
It's not easy. I think I'll have one of yours next, though.
All right, well, the boss has got the bug, so you got me. How does the campaign change? Well, you know, we live in the age of the iPad and more. It really depends on how Albo's health is. So health comes first. I've told him, rest up, mate.
This election is not just a choice about who's going to be Prime Minister.
Safety first.
It's a choice about who's going to be the Defence Minister, who's going to be the Home Affairs Minister, who's going to be the Treasurer.
That's a good message for camps.
How are you, mate?
Not bad stuff.
Nice, very good, Peter. Now, I have a strong and experienced team.
Oh, that's not as heavy as I thought. I might grab that from you.
Yeah. I see this as an opportunity, though, I've got to say. Because not only have we got a better plan, we've got a better team. And you're going to see more of them over the course of the next week.
Are you not the Labor leader that many people have been looking for?
It's Albo. It's time to give Albo a go. You know, they've got a choice here between honest Albo and smirking Scott.
I'm sorry. No.
He'll be back at the halfway mark. He'll be back when the second half starts, in a week's time.
Same concept.
You cannot compromise when you're standing up to an authoritarian government that is seeking to impose its will on the region.
Yeah, so a bit of adjustment, recalibration going on there. Suppose we can conclude that the Labor campaign was prepared up to a point for the possibility that Anthony Albanese might be laid low at some time by the virus, but that doesn't, Fran, guarantee that a smooth transition into a leaderless operation would actually be delivered at the crucial moment when the test goes positive. That has happened, of course. Even so, part of their preparations involved kitting up Anthony Albanese so that technically, at least, he could communicate through the media to the outside world, Fran, and he's done just that with you today.
Yes, of course. We all know how to do that now, don't we, Greg, after years of lockdown? But I did speak to Anthony Albanese just before coming on air. He's in isolation in his Marrickville home so far. He's holding up pretty well. Anthony Albanese in ISO, how are you feeling?
Good afternoon, Fran. Well, I've had better days, but a lot of people have had it a lot worse. So I'm one of the many millions of Australians who've gone through this. And I'm just taking the health advice. I will be isolating for 7 days here at home in Marrickville. And hopefully I get through it and I'm able to then rejoin the campaign physically rather than virtually from next week.
And 7 days in ISO, what's that going to do to your campaign, do you think?
Oh, look, we wargamed this. It's not surprising. We've had, during the campaign already, since budget week, we've had Jason Clare and Tony Burke and Christina Keneally and a range of people go down with COVID. And I think the same things happened on the other side as well. So we had war-gamed the process. We set up so that people will come in and feel the appointments that I'd made. Richard Marles will be representing me at Anzac Day in Darwin. I was really looking forward to it. It's always a special day to pay tribute to the men and women who've defended us and continue to do so. We'll get through it. This is Australia and indeed the world in 2022, unfortunately.
Sure, but politics is a confidence game. I think even you'd concede your first week of this election campaign was not a great one for you. Your second week, you seemed to pick up a bit. You had a narrow win in the debate. What's this going to do to your momentum and your confidence?
Well, we were getting momentum, but I'll be back for the second half. And this is a long campaign. And if I was going to get COVID, it is better to have got it now than in the last 3 weeks of the campaign. We have our campaign launch in Perth on the 1st of May, and hopefully I'll be right to do that. I'm taking the health advice. I will get lots of rest, lots of fluids and everything else that my doctor has told me to do. I'll certainly take that advice.
All right. Well, meanwhile, the campaign goes on. The Prime Minister and Peter Dutton have been out again today, as they have this week, accusing Labor of siding with China in this whole issue and crisis around the Solomon Islands Security Pact. Their point is it's not Australia's fault that China is seeking to spread its influence in the Solomons and in the Pacific. It's China's. Why are you blaming the Australian government, not the Chinese government?
Well, it's exactly right that China is more forward-leaning in the Pacific. That's the whole point. What was Australia doing in response to China's changed posture in our region? Australia has been the security partner of choice in the Pacific since the Second World War. The Prime Minister said just yesterday that they have known about the potential of this issue for a long period of time. We know they knew at least as far back as August. Where is the Foreign Minister? Where is she during this period? She appeared on the Insiders program and said it was all under control. The government only sent a junior representative in Mr. Seselja to the Solomons in the last week. The United States have sent their senior representative in the region, Kurt Campbell, and have responded.
Yeah, but if the government says they've taken the advice of the intelligence agencies in playing this more low-key, in sending that level of ministerial representation, what are you suggesting? They should have ignored the advice of the intelligence agencies?
Oh, come on, friend. What I'm suggesting is that this Prime Minister never takes responsibility for anything. This is a massive foreign policy failure. The government speak about a Pacific step-up. This is a Pacific stuff-up. They, when they came to office, cut aid to the region. They cut aid. They haven't built those intense relationships with countries in the region. And we know that the context of that, the forward-leaning approach of China, means that was more important than ever before. And Australia has simply dropped the ball. And it's not just me saying that, friend. Julie Bishop has said, she knows something about foreign affairs. She has said that the Foreign Minister should have been dispatched much earlier, and there should have been senior representation to the Solomons as soon as Australia became aware that these issues were on the horizon.
OK, but as you say, China is more forward-leaning. We all understand that. Some recent comments from your deputy, Richard Marles, have surfaced today. He said, quote, the idea that Pacific nations would adhere to a call from Australia to not engage with China is silly. I mean, doesn't that undercut your criticism of this being the worst foreign policy failure?
No, it doesn't at all, Fran. It doesn't. It is indicative of similar comments that Scott Morrison has made, which have been quoted today as well in the past. China has changed its position. And what it means is that we have, as Kurt Campbell calls it, competition without catastrophe is what we need to aim for in the region. We need to recognise that there is that strategic competition in the region. that China is trying to extend its influence. And if we are to maintain our influence, we need to respond, be forward-leaning, make sure that we're engaged on the policy issues that are of concern to the Solomons, but also be engaged with issues like foreign aid, be partners of choice. That historically is the role that we have played in the Pacific.
Yes, that's true. It is historically the role we've played, but the relationships and the power of China in our region has changed too. Let's get real here. If you're elected Prime Minister you wake up on the 22nd of May and you're Prime Minister, what would you do? What's the first action you would do to try and repair, in your words, the influence of Australia in the region? What step would you take?
Well, I would engage with them, and it's not just one step. The first step is that you need to have deeper relationships with your senior ministers, with the leadership in our region. We also need to engage with them on issues which are of their concern. And we know that the number one concern for the Pacific is, of course, climate change. And we would have a positive response on climate change. We want to host a conference of the parties of the UN together with our Pacific Island neighbours, for example. We wouldn't have a circumstance, Fran. Remember that all of our Pacific Island neighbours have all seen that footage of Peter Dutton, there being a joke about islands going underwater, and the now Prime Minister's response just being to refer to the boom mic that was above when those comments were made. That sort of insensitivity to major issues has undermined our standing in the region. The cutting of aid has undermined our standing in the region. We need to deepen the relationships with our neighbours.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there, but Senator Wong has said just not long ago, actually, that there will be more to say about more resources in the region. Is more dollars the answer? How much are you going to commit to that?
Well, we'll make our announcements during the campaign, but if you look at what Labor did when we were last in office, we increased our presence in the region. It's not just a matter as well of aid. One of the things that's happened on this government's watch is a gutting of our capacity in terms of diplomacy. Foreign affairs have had real cutbacks, and it has inhibited our ability to actually engage in diplomatic activity in the region. And we'll have more to say about that as well. That's part of how we need to rebuild the public service, including our foreign service.
Let's go back to the campaign more broadly. Labor's just launched a pretty hard-hitting attack ad on Scott Morrison. Is this your strategy to try and win this election, to attack Scott Morrison's character?
Fran, it would be very difficult for us to come up with more attacks on Scott Morrison than the attacks from his own side. Barnaby Joyce has said that he knew him for the longer he's known him, the more untrustworthy he has found him. You have the comments of Gladys Berejiklian saying that he cared more about politics than people during the bushfire crisis. You have the statements of Senator Fierravanti-Wells. You have a range of commentators, including the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, saying that Scott Morrison was known as someone who told lies. The truth is that those people who've worked closest with Scott Morrison are the most repelled by him, and they've made some extraordinary comments over a period of time about Prime Minister's character.
Well, nevertheless, you've got the attack ads. You've also got some scare campaigns running on the cashless debit card, also on Medicare. I mean, the truth is this government has increased funding to Medicare over the term of governments, not of coalition governments, not decreased it. Are we just going to see a rerun of the old Mediscare? Is that the way you're going to try and win it?
Fran, this government made 900 changes to the Medicare schedule in July last year with very little notice to the AMA. People weren't sure what the implications would be for their hip replacement or for various medical procedures. They did that. The out-of-pocket expenses for Medicare are going up so that they average around about $40 now. You had in the budget just a few weeks ago two ministers, one in the House of Representatives, the Assistant Treasurer, and someone in the Senate, read into Hansard that there were going to be reductions in the costs of medicines, and then changed the Hansard to say no, because they made a decision for cheaper medicines, and then they withdrew that decision sometime in between when those speeches for the budget were written. This is a government that now have appointed Anne Ruston as the potential future health minister, who said that the existing Medicare system, based upon universality, was not sustainable.
That was a long time ago, Anne Ruston said that. That was in the Abbott government. That was a long time ago.
During the time of this government, Fran. During the time of this government is when the putative health minister made those comments.
Just finally, Anthony Albanese, let's talk about the polls, because they've gone backwards. Labor's primary vote's gone backwards since the campaign started. So has your popularity as preferred Prime Minister gone backwards. The more people seeing you, it would seem on the hustings, the less they're liking you at the moment. I got to ask, is a week out of this campaign, do you think, going to help or hinder you?
Well, Fran, no one wants to get COVID. So I'll treat that question as that. No one wants to get COVID. I didn't want to get COVID. And I'll be back out there campaigning. I note the poll you referred to had a reduction of 1 point in our vote and a reduction of 1 point in the coalition vote as well. So people can read into that whatever they want. That's up to commentators to commentate. What I'm focused on is getting a better future for Australia. I'm focused on our positive agenda to strengthen Medicare, to make more things here, to address cost of living pressures. This government have no plan to address those issues. All they have are short-term measures that all end as soon as people have cast their votes. We have a plan for cheaper childcare, a plan for cheaper electricity, a plan for more secure work, a plan to lift wages, a plan for housing affordability. We have those in place, and we'll be campaigning each and every day, whether it's our members of my front bench team out there in person or me virtually, as I'm doing right now, continue to argue the case that after a decade in office, this government simply don't have any plans for the future, and they don't learn from their mistakes of the past. They're characterised by always going missing, whether it's what has occurred in the Solomons, ordering enough vaccines, ordering rapid antigen tests, or turning up for bushfires, or turning up and giving support for flood victims when they're needed.
All right, Anthony Albanese, thanks for giving us the time in ISO. I hope COVID doesn't hit too hard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fran. And can I thank everyone for the really good wishes that I've got as well, I must say. It's been very heartening.
All right. Well, yes, it's a very modern style of campaigning, very 2020s pandemic era, isn't it, Fran? Leaving aside the Spartan backdrop behind Anthony Albanese, what did you think? And you inquired about his health, obviously, and he's stoically ploughing on.
Oh, stoically ploughing on. Look, what choice does he have? They had war game this, as we've all as he revealed too. I note that the Prime Minister today offering, good wishes to Anthony Albanese. He also said he'd send him a few ideas, a few texts, make a few tips, drink more water and get some rest. But he also made a point of how much work he did when he was in ISO off with COVID. He said he put the finishing touches on a budget. He conducted national and international meetings, including meetings like the Quad, so pretty high level. I felt that was sort of somehow laying down a gauntlet for Anthony Albanese, and maybe that's why the opposition leader was up out of the blocks giving interviews today. But look, Anthony Albanese saying the bleeding obvious, really, which is so many tens and hundreds of thousands of Australians have had COVID. He's just one of them. If you look at some of the touring party with Anthony Albanese, the media, they've been hit hard there by COVID. It's going to happen, and I think Labor's probably breathing a sigh of relief. It's happening this week, Greg, between Easter and Anzac Day rather than the final week of the campaign. I think so long as he's back on deck for their Labor launch, that works for them.
And as we understand it, not only only is he determined to do that, subject to advice, I suppose, he made that point clear to you. I think they might again be building in just a couple of contingencies in case that wasn't possible. Thing about COVID, of course, Fran, is you never quite know where it's going to take you. Everyone's experience is so much different. Why don't we steer it over, though, to some of the more substantive debating points that are ongoing between Labor and the Morrison government. The Solomon Islands, foreign policy and national security foremost among them. He is flagging to you, Fran, that there is an outstanding Labor commitment that sounds like it involves additional resources for DFAT missions around the globe.
Yeah, Penny Wong really gave out this hint just not long before I did that interview, actually, mentioning they'll have more to say on resources. But, you know, the big point from Labor is, you know, they're not trying to say that China is not, you know, a bigger gorilla in the field these days. It's forward-leaning, as they like to say. But Labor's position is that Australian government needs to therefore be doing more to, you know, to offset that, to make it the partner of choice in security for the Solomons or other islands. And if the question is, how do you maintain that influence against a rising superpower like China? His answer there was, well, you do more on the policies that matter, like climate change, and Australia would seek to host a COP climate conference, for instance, but also hinting that more resources. We don't know how much, Greg. We know there's sort of no major super policy announcement from Labor coming up, but it looks as though they will have more resources there for, is it going to be an increase in the level of foreign aid? Is it going to be an increase in the level of foreign aid to the region? Is it going to be some kind of specific Pacific fund, if I can get my tongue around that? We don't know, but certainly hinting there's going to be more dollars in that pot.
And that is consistent with some of the work that Penny Wong's been building on over the last few years. So, yeah, you dwelt very much on the argy-bargy over China and Solomon Islands in that discussion, Fran, and there are some still outstanding points being argued over. In the interest of balance, though, here was Scott Morrison's counterpoint today, trying to say that sending Foreign Minister Marise Payne to Honiara wouldn't have made any difference in this case, and that he, personally, the Prime Minister, says he's been running top-level diplomacy himself with Pacific leaders.
I'm going to keep doing what we have been doing every single day. As I said, on over 100 occasions, I've had direct engagements with Pacific leaders over the last few years. I've gone into those islands. I've been a very active participant within the Pacific Islands Forum. Our Defence Forces, well, what this highlights is these are not simple issues. I mean, if it was just as easy as picking up the phone or sending a foreign minister, then these issues wouldn't occur. It's not that easy. And I think that analysis, which suggests that that's all was required, is simplistic and doesn't understand the complex nature of the forces that are at play here.
Yeah, there might be a bit of oversimplification of that argument, because I'm not sure, Fran, anyone has said that simply putting Marise Payne on a plane by itself would have changed anything.
No, I mean, look, I think there seems to be a clear argument that we haven't had a high-profile role in this, forward-leaning, to keep using that phrase, role for the Foreign Minister, and the Prime Minister said he's been on the phone. But, you know, no one is suggesting this is simple. It is complex. The geopolitical sort of realignment that's going on at the moment with China and, you know, Russia too now in partnership is the most complex situation for the world leaders to be dealing with probably at the moment. So no one's thinking it's simple. I did think it was interesting. The Prime Minister keeps saying that their intelligence advice was that they should not send the Foreign Minister. I put that to Anthony Albanese. He sort of, you know, didn't really buy that. But that's kind of interesting too, because earlier in the week when the Prime Minister was asked about intelligence advice suggesting that it doesn't help to politicise foreign policy issues or intelligence matters, the Prime Minister said, well, you know, I'm the Prime Minister, I'll be making decisions about, you know, about these kind of things. So, you know, picking and choosing when they listen to the intelligence advice and don't, Greg, perhaps.
That line does seem to move constantly, and for what it's worth, one analyst around Canberra was of the belief, without any, you know, formal knowledge, I don't understand that one of the reasons why Maurice Payne may not have been sent was that they believed this was a foregone conclusion. The deal had been done, and you would suffer a degree of humiliation or loss of face by sending a foreign minister into such a situation. Anyway, I'm sure you'll discuss that more a little later in a bit of a review of the week, but we'll move on now, Fran, towards housing, because in poll after poll, and even at this week's Leaders debate, housing affordability always comes up as a top issue of concern to voters, especially young ones who don't yet own a home. There is bipartisan agreement on the home guarantee scheme. But can more be done from the Commonwealth purse, or would that make it worse? We discuss that with Housing Minister Michael Sukkar, and we will at a later time on this program talk to Labor's Jason Clare about this too. He wasn't available today. Michael Sukkar, thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to cover off the all-important issue of housing because it does seem that the asset price surge during the pandemic has now more than ever given us a haves and haves not when it comes to property ownership. A recent Resolve survey, for instance, found that 18 to 34-year-olds, 67% of them don't think they'll be able to buy properties in the areas in which they live. Are they right?
Well, Greg, it's obviously concerning when we see data like that, because what we don't want is to wave the white flag on home ownership for Australians. And in fact, everything we've done in this term of government has been quite the contrary to that, to make very clear to Australians, and certainly from the Morrison government's perspective, we'll do everything we possibly can to support them into a home. We obviously put in place the home guarantee scheme, which has helped more than 60,000 Australians purchase a home with a deposit of as little as 5% for first home buyers or 2% for single parents. We put in place the Home Builder program, which assisted nearly 140,000 individual projects, people building new homes with a $25,000 grant. The First Home Super Saver scheme to help people save through their superannuation more quickly and save tax and therefore accelerate their deposits. So a range of programs that were put in place to help first home buyers that are materially helping first home buyers, even in that time, Greg, where we've seen really significant house price rises throughout the country. We have first home buyers at their highest levels for nearly 15 years. So my message to those young people would be, we're not waving the white flag on home ownership. We are committed to doing everything we can to assist everybody who's got an aspiration to own a home to do so. And we'll have more to say about housing as the campaign progresses.
All right. Well, of course, all of these schemes have their limitations and their caps. The home guarantee scheme, for instance, falls short in a place like Sydney of the median house price. So in what sense does that give people a leg up in those most expensive markets?
Well, look, we calibrate the house price caps at a level that takes into account a number of factors. Obviously, the median house price in that particular region or that market, but also a range of other concessions, stamp duty concessions and other things that state governments put in place. But it's important to note, Greg, that every tranche of our home guarantee schemes have been fully subscribed. So people are finding homes within those caps in each of the markets around the country, including in Sydney. We do set them at a modest level, at a modest first home buyer level. That's done very deliberately, firstly because first home buyers tend to more often be at that modest level, and also because of the income caps we've got in place, $125,000 for a single or $200,000 for a couple, that the reality of the situation is that people at those income levels are purchasing homes within those house price caps. So we've got house price caps for every single market individually. We calibrate them very, very closely to the factors that are relevant to that market. And as I said, to date, every single guarantee we've put out there has been taken up. So people are certainly able to utilise them and are finding homes within the house price caps. And we obviously announced increases to the house price caps, which we do every single financial year to make sure that we're taking into account changes in the market.
Also, the pressure, of course, flows over into rentals as well. The Commonwealth Rental Assistance Scheme, it's now worth more than $5 billion, but there is a view that it's rewarding landlords at the bottom end of the private rental market. Wouldn't there be a better use of that money, $5 billion, to transfer it across into more public housing?
Well, the Commonwealth rental assistance doesn't go to the landlords; it helps the tenants pay their rent.
Yeah.
So for people who are eligible for Commonwealth rental assistance, which is about $5.1 billion every single year, we're assisting them in the private rental market. So it's a very important part of the picture. I mean, we not only have we been a government to support first home buyers, and we've supported more than 300,000 people into a home in the last 3 years. And as I said, first home buyers at their highest levels for nearly 15 years. So we've had a real focus on first home buyers, but we've also had a focus on those who do need assistance with social and affordable housing. And in the most recent budget, we announced an additional $2 billion for the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which builds social and affordable housing. And of course, every single year we are spending $5.1 billion on Commonwealth rental assistance, $1.6 billion under the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, again supporting those people who require extra support, whether they are in private rental or whether they're in social and affordable housing, often operated by community housing providers, you know, who we've worked very closely with over the last 3 years.
Yeah, and you flagged that there will be more to say on housing throughout the course of this campaign. What sort of benchmark would you set yourself for success, either when it comes to ownership, first home ownership levels further increasing? What measures do you read for success in these schemes, given that plenty of people say the more you put in, the more you inflate the prices?
Yeah, Greg, I mean, you've got to calibrate your policies very closely. And over the last 3 years, as I said, with the Home Guarantee Scheme, with the Home Builder Program, with the First Home Super Saver Scheme, helped more than 300,000 people into a home, directly helped them. Our measure of success, though, for example, with the most recent announcement in the budget, Greg, to increase the Home Guarantee Scheme to 50,000 places a year, will be to ensure that those places are being utilised by a similar sort of cohort of first home buyers and single parents that have utilised the scheme to date. It's a massive ramping up of the scheme. We're going from about just a touch over 20,000 a year now to 50,000 every single year. It could represent some 40 to 50% of all first home buyers. So for me, ensuring that that scheme is continuing to grow the pool of first home buyers, because the reality is, Greg, for most first home buyers, the biggest hurdle is getting that deposit together. That's the biggest hurdle, particularly in a low interest rate environment. And ensuring that rather than having to save the full 20% deposit, people are now only required to save a 5% deposit, or in the case of single parents, a 2% deposit. We think this scheme has huge scope. So from my perspective, I want to continue to grow a scheme that we know is working well, that's assisted in getting first home buyers to their highest levels for nearly 15 years. And I'd like to see first home buyers getting to their highest levels for 20, 25, 30 years. They're my ambitions.
Right.
It's hard to sort of exactly quantify it, Greg, but we don't want young Australians to ever think that a coalition government would wave the white flag on home ownership. We won't. The Labor Premier here in Victoria, Daniel Andrews, said young people don't want to buy a home. Well, I disagree with that position vehemently, and I disagree with that sentiment within the Labor Party. Yeah. We think young people deserve the opportunity to purchase a home, and that's why we'll continue to grow programs like the Home Guarantee Scheme as we are.
Busy days, I know. Michael Sukkar, thanks for giving us some of your time today for Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Now, the hopes of candidates in very tight Senate races this election, as with others before it, could be aided or set back by the position secured on the often very large ballot paper. In Electoral Commission offices around the country today, blindfolded draws were held for slots across the Senate ballot for each state and territory, because the human eye is pretty well trained to read from left to right. Party positions towards the left-hand side are most favoured, especially where there are big fields of candidates and very wide ballot slips. Well, throughout this campaign, we're also trying to cover as many major and minor parties who are in with a serious show of securing seats in the next parliament. One Nation is running candidates in all lower house seats as well as the Senate. Its leader, Pauline Hanson, is on a swing through South Australia today. She caught up with us from Adelaide a little earlier. Pauline Hanson, thanks for coming on Afternoon Briefing. Like a lot of major party leaders, you are covering a lot of ground. Has Anthony Albanese falling sick with COVID caused you to, rethink your own vulnerabilities at this campaign?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. So I feel sorry for Anthony Albanese getting COVID right in the middle of the campaign, having to isolate for 7 days. But no, it hasn't changed my plans at all, or how I feel about myself.
And what would you do? What are your own contingencies, given that you are running 151 lower house candidates, Senate tickets everywhere? What would you do if COVID did strike you? What disruptions do you think it would cause?
I'm just going ahead with my plans to actually do this campaign. I've been fortunate enough. I haven't got COVID. I'm not vaccinated. And even though you are triple vaxxed, you wear your mask, you can still get COVID. And Anthony's proved that. So I'll just go ahead with my campaigning.
Now, if we move to the policy front, your party has put one up this week concerning foreign ownership of residential property. You want to ban it outright. Isn't that a heavy-handed approach, given the relatively small numbers of foreign buyers in the real estate market?
Oh, no, look, I disagree with you, and actually the Australian people support what I'm saying here. I've travelled quite extensively now, and people right across the country are very concerned that the future generations or their kids can't afford to buy houses. You've got rental accommodation problems here in South Australia, 0.6% of rental accommodation available. This is happening right across the country. So the fact is that I don't think it is. You see, the government did put in place that foreign ownership could only happen with new accommodation. Well, they've been buying up established housing. It hasn't been policed, it hasn't been looked at, there's no way of tracking it. And there is a survey that people, foreign owners, can fill out a survey. Now, under that survey, they admitted that they were in the country for more than 6 months of the year, and that was pointing to about over 6,000 homes that foreign buyers own, and they're here in the country less than 6 months of the year. I think we've got to look after those Australian people, give them the opportunity to own their own home and actually rental accommodation, so it will lessen the impact on that.
Right, well, I've seen some Foreign Investment Review Board statistics that suggest the total number of purchases by foreigners into residential real estate was just under 10,000 a couple of years ago. 10,000 is very small, isn't it, in the overall scheme of things with the Australian real estate market?
No, it's not. You see, in the housing, of trying to keep up with our own population, we're about 10 years behind in having the right number of houses in Australia. So our building is slowed. We've got a lot of people wanting their own houses to rental accommodation. You know, the facts speak for themselves. And people living in caravans, families living in their cars. I'm sorry, it's not good enough to allow people from overseas buying property in Australia, buying housing. Now, Canada and New Zealand have moved to stop foreign ownership of their housing. Why can't we? My job is to look after the Australian people, first and foremost, to ensure that they have housing, not foreigners. Would
you make this a bargaining chip, Pauline Hanson, in the event that you were sitting down with a Morrison or an Albanese government? It'd be difficult for them, I imagine, because some of these things are written into free trade agreements with other countries, for instance. They don't have a lot of latitude to negotiate this stuff.
Look, it would be a bargaining chip because I think it's very important. I have a lot of people, if you look at the surveys that are taken, people are on my side with regards to this. They're sick of, not being able to own their own houses. It escalates the price of housing as well. So you've got foreign ownership that's driving up the price of houses in Australia. You know, we've got some of the most expensive houses in Australia, in our cities. So why are we allowing this to happen? It's about looking after the Australian people.
Can I ask you, Pauline, about your negotiating strategy generally? In the event that we had a hung parliament in the lower house, you, of course, have had cause to refuse to pass the government's legislation at different points in the last parliament. Would you be openly prepared to negotiate with either a Morrison or an Albanese government on some of their policy priorities, climate change being one of them?
Look, most definitely, you know, whoever is chosen by the Australian people to be government of this country after this next election, I think it's important, you know, if I'm on the crossbench, if I am fortunate enough to actually win my seat and have that shared balance of power as I have for the last 6 years, of course you've got to work with the government, regardless whether it's the Liberal or the Labor Party, and you work it on the legislation, as I have done methodically, and with full research and listening to the grassroots Australians and businesses and people of what they expect of the governments. And that has been my job, and I will continue to act in the same way, whoever is government.
And so you are open, you have a very open mind about an Albanese government in a minority parliament situation, do you?
If it's a minority government, I have a big problem with an Albanese Greens-led government, because the Greens will put pressure on the Labor Party to pick up a lot of their policies, which I totally disagree with a lot of their policies. So it's a fact is, if you ask me, will I actually side with the Labor Greens government? Is that what your question is?
Well, you might be asked to do that, yes. Obviously, you can't control what's going on in the lower house, but it's at least a possibility at this point in time.
Well, in the lower house, I'm only talking in past experience, because we've had the shared balance of power in the Senate. But if it comes to the lower house, we have got a good chance of actually winning the seat of Hunter. Now, we came within 800 votes of actually winning that seat the last election, and Joel Fitzgibbon was really panicking about losing that seat at the last election. So who knows what's going to happen in the lower house. Yeah. I think it's going to be a very close election to call.
Yep, certainly one to watch. And look, just finally, as you say, you're fighting for your own survival there in Queensland on the Senate. If you were re-elected, do you commit to seeing out your full 6-year term, Pauline Hanson?
Most definitely, Greg. I can give you that promise that I will see out my 6-year term. And hopefully, if I've still got great health, and I've got the determination and passion to still fight for the people of Australia, I might even go again after that, Greg, so don't underestimate me.
No, we're not underestimating you. I only ask in the context of whether George Christensen is your plan B, for instance.
Oh, right. No, there's no plan B whatsoever. No, it's me. It's me all the way.
All right, Pauline Hanson, we'll let you go about your campaigning in South Australia and elsewhere. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks for having me on, Greg.
Yeah, already looking towards the possible next election after the next election. But anyway, Fran, even in a week that's been shortened by Easter, there's a fair bit to pick over this week, and you're just about to do that.
Yeah, we're coming up with the Journos panel. At the end of week 2 of the campaign, there's still no clear frontrunner, Greg. Polls reporting many undecided voters, even more looking to vote for anyone but the major parties, it would seem. 29% preferring independents and minor parties. The next week's going to be a challenging one for Labor, with Anthony Albanese out of action. I'm joined now by Karen Middleton from the Saturday Paper and Paul Karp from Guardian Australia. Paul, Karen, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thanks, Fran.
So, Karen, Anthony Albanese is in isolation. I spoke with him earlier from his home in Marrickville. What impact do you think this is likely to have on the campaign? Much at all?
It's an interesting question. Well, it's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, he can't be out introducing himself to people, and he can't be on location with the high vis and all the rest of it. I'm sure he would prefer that he didn't get COVID at all, but I think I heard him say to you he'd rather have it now than have it right at the end of the campaign or when he's meant to be doing his launch or whatever.
Sure.
Maybe if you want to make a virtue of it, it's a chance for a bit of a reset for him. I mean, it's pretty tiring running around the country and on and off aircraft and the like, so at least he's not doing that. But he'll be hoping he doesn't get hit with the COVID tiredness. So it's hard to know exactly how it's going to affect the campaign. I guess it makes it a bit harder for Mr Morrison to go for the jugular if Mr Albanese is down for the count and unwell. So it probably does change the tone of the campaign right across the board.
Well, you might think that, but I think Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton went very hard on the Solomon Islands issue again today, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But just before I do, Paul, Labor, as Anthony Albanese told us, have been preparing for this. They've got a team. They're boasting about the strength of their team, and you'll see the team on display. And Jason Clare was making much of the team. Scott Morrison, in response, said, I'll be happy to compare my team to their team any day. How do you think the team thing is going to work? Who does that benefit, do you think? Either major party?
Well, I do think it gives people in Labor like Penny Wong and Jason Clare more of a chance to step forward and to carry the burden while Anthony Albanese is in isolation. I also think that Labor wants to make the election a referendum on Scott Morrison, and whereas Morrison wants a choice between himself and Albanese, and that is harder for Morrison to achieve if Anthony Albanese is in isolation. And we saw in his round of interviews this morning that Morrison was basically saying, oh, well, I kept working through COVID when I had it, and sort of jawboning Anthony Albanese to show up and to keep doing interviews and press conferences while he's in isolation. So I think that shows that it's not necessarily a huge disadvantage. It's not a disaster to have happen in the second wave.
So, as you say, he was really making much of that and sort of taunting in his set. Well, he wasn't that extreme, but, Albanese to keep working. But you saying, I thought that was just about, OK, come on, what kind of bloke are you? Keep working. You're thinking that was more about they want to keep Anthony Albanese front and centre in the campaign. Karen?
Well, possibly. I think Paul's got a point, that in the end it is the opposition wants it to be about Scott Morrison and the government wants it to be about Anthony Albanese because it detects that people are still hesitating about him. And Paul's right, it's harder to make that point if he's absent. I suppose the risk for Anthony Albanese is that some of the others stepping up and getting a chance to speak might be doing a little bit better than he did. I saw some people praising Jason Clare today for some of the one-liners that he delivered in his comments. So, it could go either way, I suppose, but it gives him a chance to reset. But he would want to be coming back strong and not repeating the sort of problems he had in week one.
Yeah, in the end, you get COVID, and many Australians have had to cope with that and fit it in their lives. Paul, you're the fact checker for The Guardian. You're the fact checker here on this panel. Can we check some facts that have been flying around over this whole security deal between the Solomon Islands and China this week? The government's repeated claims that he started off in the debate, Scott Morrison, with this line. He's kept it going all week, which is Labor always takes China's side. Have you had a look at that? Is that true?
Well, I think that he's attempted to point to Labor's past record in terms of defence spending, whereas Labor argues that China's stance is a lot more aggressive recently, so that's not a fair comparison. Morrison's picked on a few loose statements about Australia would dispute some of China's trade disputes with Australia, and he's said that leaves an open question about which ones does Labor think that there's any substance to. So that's what they're grasping at. But really, Labor has done so much work in this term to eliminate the differences in policy between the two major parties on China. There's not a lot there. Today it was, criticising Richard Marles for a book that he wrote. But basically, they're trying to imply that because he was saying that we should welcome China's foreign aid development assistance in the Pacific, that is somehow, rolling out the red carpet for what they've done with a security pact with Solomon Islands. So it's a bit of a stretch. There are very few, if any, differences between the majors.
OK, Karen, I'm just going to stay with the fact checker for a minute because there is one firm fact, I think, but I hate to put you on the spot. I don't know if you've checked this, but all week I've been meaning to, which is Labor keeps saying the Morrison government has cut aid to the Solomons. The government keeps saying it's increased aid to the region. Has government cut aid to the Solomons? Do you know that, Paul, or Karen? You might know it.
I think they're both right, and then I think there was an initial cut at the start of the coalition government that has since been restored. So it's one of those selective things that I think they're both right.
All right. Karen, you've been around the whole area of foreign affairs for a while. Labor really sort of took the gloves off on this when Penny Wong came out with that statement, the worst foreign policy failure in the Pacific since the Second World War. Was that overblown, and what is the sort of the unearthing of some of the comments from Richard Marles, the Deputy Labor leader, do? Does it blunt that attack?
Well, I think it's a fair point to make that the situation with China has changed. Successive governments have wanted to cosy up to China in trade terms because of the cash cow that China has been for Australian commodities, but also tread a bit carefully in security terms. That concern has been exacerbated in the last couple of years, and now there's out and out direct concern about China's intentions in the region on both sides of politics. So people are being held to account for comments they made a few years ago when they were much more inclined to on the cozying up side than the caution side, and I think that's the case for both the coalition and for Labor. Certainly Richard Marles made a speech in Beijing in 2019 that was praising of Beijing's engagement in the Pacific and gave the distinct impression that Labor considered it to be benign at worst and advantageous at best. And certainly the federal government has been praising of China's engagement in the past and has started to change its tune in the last couple of years. So in large part, China's stance has changed, and that has to affect the policy position on both sides of federal politics here.
OK, the question in an election campaign to both of you is this going to make a difference to the voters? I mean, national security is the button that's trying to be pushed here, or pushed back in Labor's case. Paul and then Karen, it's unusual to see foreign policy dominate an election campaign. Do you think the voters who are, as the government keeps reminding us, busy with their kids, busy with their bills, trying to pay the bills, do you think they're going to notice this?
Well, I went to Western Australia and spoke to undecided voters in the marginal seats there, and I don't. Some people had concerns with Anthony Albanese, but it wasn't anything specific about China or Labor's handling of foreign policy. And in fact, several people mentioned that they thought that Scott Morrison had been too aggressive on politicising that issue, and it may have further compromised relations with China. So it cuts both ways, and also to have this security agreement inked in the a month out from the election campaign could lead some people to say that the coalition hasn't done as well, despite national security traditionally being a strength of theirs.
Yeah, Karen, I think that's Labor's viewpoint. What do you think? Just briefly, do you think this is going to cut through?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think what the government is trying to do is portray Labor as weak generally. And so in that respect, it's less directly about China and more about whether Labor is strong enough to govern. And that's the message they're trying to get across. And they will use any particular theme they can to underline that. OK, another debate that's raged all week and beyond is around Scott Morrison's captain's pick for the Liberal candidate in the seat of Warringah. Catherine Deves is her name. She's an outspoken critic on the issue of trans women in sport. The Prime Minister took a back step once it was revealed some of Catherine Deves' old tweets were revealed. They were distasteful. The Prime Minister stepped back. But then he really lunged forward, Karen, and really leant on, won't play to cancel culture, won't silence Ms Deves, won't see her silence. Why is he doing this? I think he detects that there's some sympathy for Catherine Deves' views in terms of women and sport, but also it gives him a chance to talk about issues of concern to women in a different way than he might have been doing not so successfully in the last couple of years. I think if he was concerned about it as an issue, he wouldn't keep talking about it. Now, you can say that perhaps the likes of Matt Keane, the New South Wales Treasurer, who spoke so forcefully against Catherine Deves and called for her disendorsement, his interventions might be the reason, and some are arguing this, that Scott Morrison keeps getting asked about it and keeps answering in the manner that he does. But he could quieten the debate down if he wanted to. He could neutralise it and move on. He does that very effectively on other issues. He's choosing to engage quite directly and turn this into an issue of being woke, of walking on eggshells, of political correctness, of being told what to do. There's kind of a hint about that residual COVID anti-mask wearing resistance movement, people who don't like being told what to do and what to think and what to say. So I think there's an element of that he is seeing might well be engaging positively well for him in some electorates, if not badly for him in some of those inner city so-called teal seats that they're desperately trying to hang on to. Yeah, Paul, did you want any of that sentiment when you're in those marginal seats in WA or anywhere else?
Well, no one was mentioning trans inclusion or women's safety in sport, but I think what's happened here is that, Catherine Deves' advocacy was very well known, but they didn't have the time to go through tweet by tweet and consider, well, how will that look? Well, how will that, Nazi analogy look in an election campaign? And because of the extraordinary intervention and the way that the three-person panel, including, Scott Morrison, chose the remaining candidates at the last minute, I think he feels that he can't abandon her, and so it's better to try and make a virtue out of it, as Karen said, by pivoting to, you know, cancel culture more generally.
Just finally, Karen, we're almost out of time, but I know you've been sort of delving into this a bit. As Paul mentioned, her views were known, maybe not this sort of extremity of them, but perhaps they should have been. What does that tell us that they chose her anyway?
Well, I think the Prime Minister chose her quite deliberately. They thought she was a good candidate. Depends who you talk to. Some people say he wanted a woman. He was prepared to argue the toss on the women in sport thing if it became a problem. Other people are more cynical and think that he chose her because of those views, that it was an issue that he wasn't unhappy talking about. Claire Chandler, his Tasmanian senator, has got a private member's bill in the Parliament on Save Women's Sport, which just happens to be exactly the title of Catherine Deeves' organisation that she runs. So, you know, there has been a bit of a gender-related theme that the Prime Minister has been talking about in recent times, ever since that Religious Freedom Bill didn't go so well for him in the Parliament. It seems to be something he's not unhappy about talking about, and I think that's interesting.
All right, Karen Middleton, Paul Karp, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Fran.
Have a great campaign.
All right, well, time's almost up for us, Fran, but before we go, there is one last thing we wanted to share with everyone, because we've entered that sometimes madding phase of the campaign when parties' television advertisements start to fill our screens big time. Enter Tasmania's Jackie Lambie. Of course, always one to style herself as an anti-politics type of politician. The Tassie Senators now put some serious spending behind an ad that builds on her personal brand.
The Jackie Lambie Network. Politics. Without the politicians.
Barefoot politics, or short and to the point, whichever way you look at it, Fran. She does do things in her own distinctively Jackie Lambie kind of way.
She sure does, and she always cuts through, Greg.
Yep. Now, no doubt week 3, Fran, is going to take us into uncharted territory once again. That much we have learnt from week 2 and discussed at great length today, especially with Labor now having to mix up its game. So we'll be back, won't we, next week to try and unpack all of that for everyone, but probably best for now to wrap it up and look forward to a slightly longer weekend once again, Fran.
Yeah, we won't be here on Anzac Day. We'll be back on Tuesday. Everybody have a good weekend. If you are in ISO, Anthony Albanese and all the other thousands of Australians who are, you know, good luck with isolation this weekend. The campaign goes on. There's no escaping that unless you turn off the telly. But otherwise, have a good weekend. See you soon.
We can't undo the lies we had to tell, girls.
I'm Finn, Dennis's son.
You have no idea what